Coming up on Arirang News, more than a dozen people in South Korea lose their lives over the weekend as yet more monsoon rain triggers floods and landslides. The government's working to get these regions aid. The South Korean government pays out a record sum in unemployment benefits in the month of July. There are signs of improvement, though, in some parts of the service sector. And President Moon Jae-in suggests the establishment of a body to monitor the effects of government policies on South Korea's overheated real estate market. In the meantime, he says more measures are on the way. It's 5 p.m. here in Seoul. Thank you for tuning in to Arirang News. I'm Devin Whiting. The central and southern parts of South Korea, already flooded, got even more rain over the weekend. From Friday to Sunday, at least 13 people lost their lives, 2 others still missing. Thousands were also forced from their homes. Lee Kyung-eun has the details.
Due to the past 9 days of heavy monsoon rain in South Korea, 31 people have died and 11 gone missing. Nearly half of the casualties were reported over the last weekend when torrential rain slammed the central and southern part of the country. Authorities say 13 people died and 2 went missing from Friday to Sunday, while some 4,400 had to evacuate. That amounts to nearly 7,000 evacuees in total. The country's southwestern Jeollabuk-do province is among the hardest hit areas. Floods inundated villages near the Samjingang River after the river broke its banks. In the southern part of Jeollado province, much of Gokseong County is now covered with mud due to a massive landslide. In Gyeongsangnam-do province, people are dealing with an enormous amount of trash that flowed in due to the water bomb. Recovery work is underway in the affected areas. Among some 13,000 facilities that have been destroyed, including farmland, about 2/3 have received emergency recovery aid. To speed up efforts, Finance Minister Hong Nam-gi is urging the government to provide aid immediately, even calling for the use of extra budget if necessary. Currently, families living in areas recently declared so-called special disaster zone can receive about $800 if their homes are flooded, $5,400 in case of partial destruction, and some $10,000 for total destruction. To further ease the burden on the people, he ordered payment dates for electricity bills, health insurance, and national pensions be delayed. Lee Kyung-eun, Arirang News.
Starting today, South Korea is allowing people to enter the country from China's Hubei province, whose capital city, Wuhan, is where the COVID-19 virus first emerged late last year. This is under a plan announced last week in view of the fact that Hubei province has not reported new cases of the virus recently, and because China started opening back up to South Koreans. People who'd recently been to Hubei had not been allowed to come into South Korea since early February. An article published Sunday in a top Japanese newspaper claims that the reason North Korea is developing nuclear missiles is to target Japan, not the United States. In the Sankei Shimbun, the author notes that North Korea now has missiles that can reach as far as the United States, and that leader Kim Jong-un has been emphasizing deterrence, especially when it comes to the U.S. Still, he claims, the nuclear-capable missiles the regime has are designed to reach Japan and are not just a threat to the country. They can now be used at any time. The OECD says that even if the South Korean economy shrinks this year, as is projected, it's still likely to rise 3 notches to become the world's 9th largest. The OECD forecasts South Korea's nominal GDP to decline by 1.8% this year to about $1.5 trillion. That would move it from 12th biggest to the 9th biggest among the 37 members of the OECD, plus 9 non-members. It would move past Brazil, Canada, and Russia, whose economies the pandemic has hit harder. The world's biggest economy will still be the United States, despite a contraction of 5.7%. South Korea paid out a record amount of unemployment benefits last month at around $1 billion. It's still tough for local job seekers, but there has been a degree of recovery seen in the service sector. Ji-young has the details.
South Korea's unemployment payout hit an all-time high in July. According to the Ministry of Employment and Labor, the government in July paid out roughly $1 billion in unemployment benefits, up a whopping 56.6% compared to a year earlier. This broke the previous record set just a month before of roughly $935 million. The amount of unemployment paid has set a new record every month this year since February. But the data do show some signs of a recovery. The number of people working and paying into employment insurance system last month, meaning they're employed, was around 13.9 million people, a net increase of more than 185,000 on year.
By industry, the recovery is largely focused on the service industry, where the number of subscriptions was up 237,000 on year and has continued to increase for 3 straight months.
Within the service industry, there were increases in the sectors of health and welfare, public administration industry, and education services, but there was a decline in food and lodging. The ministry officials said that although it's recovering, the job market is still in difficult situation. The manufacturing industry has seen a decrease in employment insurance subscriptions for 11 straight months. 엄지영, Arirang News.
Time now for an in-depth look at the market news on this Monday. And for that, I'm joined on the line by Dr. Yang Jun-seok, Professor of Economics at the Catholic University of Korea. Professor Yang, good to have you back on.
Happy to be here.
Well, U.S. unemployment numbers for last month were better than expected, but there's a lot of uncertainty when it comes to the tensions with China and the new stimulus bill. So stocks last Friday were mixed. Korean stocks, though, strongly higher today. What's the story in the markets?
Okay, well, as you mentioned, the U.S. stocks were doing very well at the early part of last week, but for Dow and S&P, it plateaued on Friday, and NASDAQ dropped on Friday. And, well, the market was expecting the unemployment rate to be about 10.6%, but it actually beat the expectation, and the actual numbers were 10.2. So you'd imagine that the market would improve, but as I mentioned, it either plateaued or it dropped. And that's probably because the Congress could not agree on the stimulus package and extension of unemployment benefits. Now, President Trump, because the Congress could not agree, he did sign some executive order to provide some type of stimulus, but after looking at the executive orders that President Trump has signed, most analysts believe that it's not going to do much good. Part of what President Trump did was he delayed the payroll tax payment, but it's delayed. It's not forgiven, so most people will have to pay the tax anyway by the end of the year, and chances are the employers will withhold the payroll tax anyway, just in case they have to pay it, or if the President Trump's executive order is found to be not legal. And then President Trump also signed an executive order giving $400 additional payment to the unemployment, but he insisted that 25% of that should come from the state government, and because state government has already spent so much money, it's not quite sure whether they'll have enough budget, and it's also not clear whether President Trump has the constitutional right to do this, because budget is supposed to be formed by Congress. And then finally, even if President Trump can give the money, this money is going to come from the disaster fund for the FEMA, Federal Emergency Management Agency, and United States is also having a lot of natural disaster problems right now with the weather and so on. So it's not entirely clear whether President Trump's executive order will help the U.S. economy, and I think that's why the market has not been doing so well. In Europe, the market was better than expected because of the U.S. data. The Asian markets today were mixed. That's partially because of the rising U.S.-China tensions. President Trump's executive order cutting off TikTok and WeChat from doing business in America, as well as a threat of putting executive order that sanctions key Hong Kong government officials. So while China is rising today. Hong Kong is falling, and Japan, Nikkei, is falling as well. KOSPI and KOSDAQ, it's doing very well. KOSPI has been rising continually since last week. It rose 1.48% today. KOSDAQ, it has been continually been rising for two weeks, but there has been some changes in the composition. Individuals bought KOSPI and KOSDAQ today, while institutions and foreigners sold, which hasn't always been the case in the last couple of weeks. And the bull market is attributed to Trump's executive orders that I explained earlier that supposedly give aid to the unemployed in the United States. But if that really is the reason, then I question whether the Korean investors fully understand the President Trump's executive orders.
That's a great point. Well, here in Korea, speaking of budgets, the Korean government's already had three of them, three extra budgets this year, which is a record to deal with the coronavirus. Now, because of the floods, some are talking about a fourth one. That's something that hasn't happened in Korea since 1961. Do you think that's a real possibility?
I think it is a real possibility. If you look at how much the other countries spent, then it's actually Korea did not spend that much on supplementary budget. So far with the three supplementary budget, Korea spent about 59.2 trillion won. That's about 3% of GDP. Now, if you look at the United States, they spent about $6 trillion already, and they're thinking about another additional budget bill as well. And that's actually nearly 30% of GDP. Now, Statistica did a little analysis in June, so it's a slightly old statistic, and they exclude loan guarantees, but they calculated how much stimulus each country spent on coronavirus until June of this year. Japan actually spent more than 20% of their GDP as stimulus, United States 13.2%, EU 4.3%. Now, Korea, while the total package is more than 3% of GDP, because they're taking out loan guarantees, it turns out that Korea only spent about 1% range of GDP on coronavirus stimulus so far. So that means Korea, compared to the size of its economy, probably spent less than these countries. And then Korea is having record flooding problems. So it's not quite clear whether Korea has enough cash on hand to deal with not only the coronavirus and all its implications, but also the flooding problems. So there will probably be a supplementary budget, even though right now the Moon administration and the ruling party is saying that's not necessary. If worst comes to worst, they say that they can take money from next year's budget, but I don't think that is a very good practice. Rather than take the next year's budget, they're going to need the money next year. So if we need some additional money this year, we should budget additional money this year. And there is a cloud in the silver lining here. Repairing the flood damage is a legitimate use of government money. So it'll act not only to repair the damages, but also act as a macroeconomic stimulus and job creation so that it can partially combat the recession that came from the coronavirus.
Well, we're almost out of time, Professor, but it's the start of a new week. What's on your radar in the days ahead?
Okay, well, there's the government finance and budget trend data for August, and that should give the latest trend on the government budget deficit. July employment figures are also coming up for Korea, and that should always be interesting. And then another interesting statistics for Korea is the June money supply and liquidity figures, as well as July financial market trends. We've been talking a lot about real estate and housing in Korean economic news, and a lot of that is attributed to there being too much liquidity in the economy. And hopefully the BOK announcement will give some decent estimates on the actual liquidity numbers.
All right, we'll be speaking soon again about that, Professor. Thanks so much for coming on today.
Thank you.
Now, President Moon Jae-in has called on the government to review the possibility of setting up a supervisory body to monitor the effectiveness of the government's policies on the real estate market. In a meeting with his top aides on Monday, Moon vowed continued measures to get home prices under control as the administration's most pressing task when it comes to people's livelihoods.
이번 대책이 완전할 수는 없는 것이므로 계속해서 보완해 나가겠습니다. 또한 대책의 실효성을 위해 필요시 부동산 시장 감독기구 설치도 검토하겠습니다.
The president's remarks follow a series of measures to cool the property market, including a boost in supply and policies to better protect tenants' rights. Moon said that the government will be doing its best to reduce any confusion in the market. He also said that it's natural for the government to intervene in the property market and that although South Korea has raised property taxes, its rates are still among the lowest globally. The president stressed that the housing market should not be used for investment, but as a social benefit. He also said he'll look at further measures to reduce the tax burden on people who own just one low to mid-priced home and to improve housing for the underprivileged. And that brings us to the end of this newscast. Thank you for watching. More live news coming your way at 7 p.m. Korea time.